In this video, we'll discuss stance theory. Stance theory, which was first developed by Dubois, is interested in what people do in interaction with each other and basically what happens as a result of interaction. What is the social consequences of it? The basic building blocks of stance theory are speakers, or we could say interactants, because this could be done just as easily via text message or chat. And these speakers assign value to some object of interest. It could be the other person they're talking to, it could be about some present topic or object, it could be about some absent object or person. But this act of assigning value to this thing is what they say is taking a stance on that thing, taking a stance on something. Now this is part of our folk language that we would say, oh, I have a stance on this, what's your stance on whatever topic? But this is more of a technical definition of stance taking, which involves two people in interaction. Stance doesn't exist beforehand. It's not like an opinion. It's very different than an opinion. An opinion about something could exist before you ever spoke about it or before you ever wrote about it, whereas stance only gets called into being in the instant that it's taken, that it's done, that it's spoken into existence, or that it's written into existence. Stance is always a linguistic act, and it's not only a linguistic act, it's not only an act of language, but it's always a social act. It always has social consequences for what is being done. So there may be private opinions, but there's no such thing as a private stance in this theory. You can't privately have a stance on something. Stance only exists in the moment that you direct language at somebody else, and that language is assigning value to some other object. We have this kind of three-way thing. We have who the stance taker is. In this case right here, it would be Sam. We have what the object of the stance is, which is those, and we also need another person, another stance taker. So what stance the stance taker is responding to. Sam saying, I don't like those, is probably being done in response to what he imagines someone else might be thinking about it. And in this line where Angela says, I don't either, that's very clear. Angela is taking a stance in response to the stance that Sam took. So basically we could sort of write the formula of stance theory as basically saying I, if I'm the stance subject, the stance taker, I evaluate something else, that other thing. By evaluating that thing, I position myself as a certain type of person, and this is where the identity work comes in, is in that act of positioning. We'll talk about that in a second. And then if I evaluate something, and by so evaluating it, I end up always positioning myself, you come in and you evaluate that same thing. And because of your evaluation, either you and I get aligned by having the same stance, or we're disaligned by taking opposing stances. A stance could be an outright evaluation, which is obvious, something like Sam here saying, I don't like those. You could say, oh, that's horrible, that's nasty, where you're giving a value to a certain object, whatever the that stands for here. It could be more affective. I'm not trying to describe a property of the stance object, the thing I'm talking about. Rather, if I'm doing an affective stance, I'm trying to describe a property of myself. Like, oh, I'm so glad. That thing is kind of not being described, but I'm actually just coming right out and saying how I feel about it. I'm so glad, or things like ew or wow are actually expressions of affect. Alignment we normally think of as an indirect result of stance taking, but people can go right out and align. They can actually make their alignment known. If you say something like totally, that is an act of alignment. It sort of stands for the fact that I'm taking the same stance as you. If you say, oh, this pizza is awesome, totally. I don't have to say, I agree that this pizza is awesome. Totally does the same thing. It's kind of like how a pronoun stands for a whole noun phrase. This sort of alignment phrase will kind of stand for that whole act of trying to make the same evaluation that you did. This pizza is amazing. I could just say, I know, right? Or I agree with you. These are alignments that are spoken into being. They're a little bit less a stance. They kind of are shortcut or stand for the fact that I'm going to take the same stance as you, and I'm sort of skipping that step by making our alignment obvious or making it known. This is sort of Dubois' diagram of the stance triangle, and maybe we can explain it. So if here's me, a speaker or a typer, here's you, you're somehow involved in this situation, And then this would be the stance object. So this is going to be some statement I'm taking a stance about, some claim that somebody made that I'm taking a stance toward. It could be a fact, which I evaluate in some way, some link if we're doing social media or doing this on Facebook. Maybe you posted a link and I'm taking a stance toward it. You posted a picture, you typed your opinion. So all of these things, or actual just objects, or even people themselves, could be the stance object. So I'm going to take a stance if I take an evaluative stance toward this object. Again, let's just pretend we're talking about Miley Cyrus here. And I take the stance, Miley Cyrus is amazing. I'm evaluating her positively. The side effect is going to position. It's kind of sort of like a backfiring. It's always going to be positioning me as a certain type of person. There's a certain group of people in your mind of the people who think Miley Cyrus is amazing. Now, exactly what attributes that group has might differ from person to person. It could be that in your mind you think all Miley Cyrus likers are sellouts, or you could think that they're all rebels. It could be that you think they're all country people who are hicks, or it could be that you think that they're all angsty suburban teenagers. So whatever it is, if I take a stance, a positive stance in this case, toward the stance object, Miley Cyrus, that's going to have the side effect of positioning me as a certain type of person. So identity work is being done by me. I'm trying to call into being a certain type of identity as an indirect effect of the stances that I take towards this. So it's not primarily about evaluating Miley Cyrus. She doesn't actually care at all what I would think about her, but I'm doing it in order for me to have an identity effect. Another reason that I might ever talk about Miley Cyrus, someone that I'm unlikely to ever meet or to ever think about, is that it gives me an opportunity to either align or disalign with you. If you come in and be like, oh yeah, totally, you're basically signaling that we have the same alignment. So that's the shortcut. I'm going to understand that you also think Miley Cyrus is amazing. It could be that you're like, huh? No, she's so derivative. If you say something like that and you take a negative stance towards her, that is also going to position you. It's going to call a certain identity for you into being. And it's also going to have the effect of distancing the two of us. We're going to disalign because we have different opinions about Miley Cyrus. Me and you are going to grow further apart. Whereas if me and you have the same opinion about Miley Cyrus, if we take an aligning stance, we're going to move closer together. We're going to align with each other. And this is why stance taking is done in this theory, is primarily to do identity work for me, or for you to do identity work in response to me, and for the two of us to thereby grow closer together or to grow further apart. So there's two basic kinds of stances. All of these are stances or involve a speaker taking a stance on something. Like, I was laughing so hard. This is exactly, dude. So there's epistemic stances, there's affective stances. We talked about evaluative stances, which are sort of easy to spot. These are a stance that basically says, is something good or bad? An epistemic stance is a stance which says how I know something. Epistemology is the study of how people know what they know. So I'm taking a stance about the truthfulness of this claim, or about the certainty that I have towards a particular claim. So I could make an evaluative stance, like Miley Cyrus is awesome, and then I could actually take an epistemic stance toward that evaluative stance and say something like, I kind of think that Miley Cyrus is awesome. So the object of that I kind of think is going to be the claim, the other stance, Miley Cyrus is awesome. That stance is itself an evaluative stance, but that I kind of think is a stance towards that claim. It's saying, like, I'm sort of uncertain about it. I'm not sure that it's totally truthful. An affective stance is not talking about an attribute of the stance object, whether the stance object is a good or a bad thing. It's going to be a stance revealing my emotional orientation towards that thing. You could think of this as being an indirect side effect of whether something is good or bad, but sometimes that's really ambiguous. You know, I could say that something like a flower, which we normally think is a good thing, if I say flowers make me sad, I'm not making a claim about whether flowers are good or bad. I'm not evaluating at all the goodness or badness of a flower. All that I'm doing is trying to reveal to you my emotional stance toward this, what flowers trigger within me. So I was laughing so hard. This is going to be more of an affective stance. This is more of an epistemic stance. Dude, I guess could be either one, right? I could say, dude, and maybe that would be an affective of positive affect. If I was like, dude, with that intonation, I might be expressing doubt about what you're saying. Like I'm taking an epistemic stance toward your claim that I really don't believe you. There's no way that would be an epistemic stance, like I'm not trusting you. I could be being sarcastic, actually, like that no way is actually a act of I do believe you, which can be tricky, obviously, for a learner to do. So take maybe a minute for yourself and pause and like think through whether you think these things are more epistemic in nature or more affective in nature. Okay, so let's look at a real-life example of discourse and see how stance might play out. Remember, in taking a stance, the stance taker, who is kind of person number one, or stance subject one, that top corner of the triangle, is going to evaluate some sort of object. The stance object doesn't have to be a physical object. It can be a claim, a person, an idea, another stance. Thereby positioning that subject, which usually involves positioning yourself. And I'm going to align with other stance subjects because you will have the opportunity to take a similar stance, or maybe you already did take a similar stance prior, or maybe you took an opposing stance prior to my active stance taking. And so whether I'm responding to a stance that you took or whether you're responding to a stance that I took, the end result is going to be alignment or disalignment. So let's look at this little screenshot from a typical Facebook. So here is the stance object. There's this link to a song on Grooveshark. So this is sort of talking about the song and who's playing it. And the person whose Facebook this is writes, "This song is amazing." So this is the stance object. This is the stance object here. Amazing is going to be the stance. This is an evaluative stance, a positive evaluative stance. And then here they're giving a little bit more information about this stance object. This is a little outside of stance theory. There's no real stance being taken here, just they're called Rand, they're from Ireland. Then again, she's repeating the same stance that she took before. This song is amazing, they're really cool. And then what we see sort of in the comment function, and this is part of the reason why Facebook became so popular, I think, is it basically reduced this human need to stance take into a very easy to manipulate digital form. So you can do like, comment, or share. Share is usually implicitly an act of alignment. If I share something that you posted, usually that means I align with it. That's the default setting. In order to show that I disalign with it, or disalign with you and your stance toward it by sharing, I would need to usually add a comment. Comment is my chance to do stance work. The simplest thing to do is like, and basically like, you might as well say align. It's kind of like an alignment button that I can click here. It just means I agree. It just means I agree. I think the exact same thing that you do about this. It's a little bit unclear sometimes whether the like is, do I like the song? Is it an act of positively evaluating this object, or am I positively evaluating your stance toward this object? So you have to really read the context carefully to tease that apart. But here we can see that there was two people who clicked that like button, Allison and Marianne. So their names end up showing up on here, that they like this. Probably this means, in this case, that they like the song itself, rather than liking the fact that the poster likes this song. And then Haley even goes so far as to write an actual comment here, "Oh man, so good." So "oh man" is an affective stance about something that happens. In this case, it's kind of like I'm stuck, like I'm arrested by the emotion that I'm experiencing. But "oh man," it could be a negative or positive emotion, that's unclear, but that's specified here in this positive evaluative stance, "so good." So what ends up happening is that Allison and Marianne end up aligning with the poster, the person who originally typed this comment, by their act of liking, which creates social bonds between Allison and the poster, between Marianne and the poster, and also actually between Allison and Marianne, since they both see that they both like this. Haley probably even goes a little bit further by not just liking it, by actually commenting on it, and by overtly adding her evaluation in language, by taking the stance linguistically, Haley probably even builds a stronger sense of alignment with the original poster. So here we can see how a stance theorist might actually read an artifact like this. And in fact, Dubois sees stance taking as being the basic building block of all human languaging. This is mostly why we language. That it might have been in a time that we actually would need to share crucial information, like where can I find honey or how many buffalo are over the hill. But most of the time, what humans are doing is less sharing missing information and more doing social work, building social relationships, nurturing, cultivating those social relationships, or distancing themselves from people that they don't want a relationship with via their stance taking. And that's certainly become important in this age. And social media is a great sphere in which to study sort of stance taking in its purest form. So the kinds of language acts in terms of social action theory, which are especially characterized by stance taking, I think something like going to an art museum and commenting on the art, there's going to be a lot of stance taking there. The comment sections after a newspaper article online, there's going to be full of stance taking toward various actors or various ideas that were raised within the article, as well as towards other stances which are being taken by other commenters in the comment section. Are there any places that you can think of where you would find very little stance taking? I think maybe this could be done on something like the trade floor of the stock market, where people are basically just calling out like the numbers and the values of the different stocks, and people aren't doing much stance work in that situation where it's high pressure. We're just basically transmitting information from a person who knows the information to a person who does it. Or if you have a lecture where you're just listening to someone talk for a long time, you could think of this as stance as being object, because stance always arises in dialogue. Stance can't happen monologically. You need two people interacting in order for stance to occur. But if we think about it, is alignment or disalignment totally absent? Well, there are people in the audience who might shout out something like, yeah, or they could be nodding their heads in some ways as an act of non-linguistic, pure demonstration of alignment, or putting a quizzical look on your face, or even walking out the door might be an act of disalignment. If linguistically, as an audience member, you're not allowed to talk, you're prevented from talking because of the social rules, people might find some other nonverbal way to express their alignment or to express their disalignment.